Good afternoon. Hello, colleagues. Welcome to today's session. I am uh, in the middle of load shedding at the moment, so please excuse me. I will try and keep the chat open on my phone and make sure that I'm actually engaging with you in terms of the slides and the discussion spaces. Um, so if anything, please feel free to put your microphone on if I am missing anything. Okay. So today's Enable webinar focuses on course outline. And just to touch on the outcomes of today's session, in terms of understanding the concept of the course outline and where it fits in terms of the Enable framework, um, in terms of discussing what the value of inclusive um, course outline and how we can use words and structure things in spaces so that we are allowing for co-creation to explain what it is and how this framework can work differently in terms of the discussions that we have with our colleagues and what we value in terms of our course outline and adjusting how we think about it and to understand the fundamentals of everything. So for those of you who have not been in the previous webinars that we have, just to touch on the enabled framework, which is part of the RBC project, Redesigned and Blended Learning courses. And this is a project run by Janet, who is currently in the space today. So if you do have any questions, I'm not too sure if Janet is staying for the full session, please feel free to ask questions, especially about the bigger project. So it's designed to promote inclusively digitally enabled learning for all students, and we'll unpack a little bit more about what that is in a moment, and create open educational resources. So not sort of drawing you into having to think about creating and your course outline or how to include students and have to create everything from scratch, but sort of providing you with the tools that is needed for you to sort of create and co-create and redirect in a different way. So just a reminder that this Enable framework draws from UDL and TD principles and draws from both of them so that we can marry those two principles and look at how do we do this in practice, because there's a lot of theory behind it, but how do we know when to draw on which principles and what to look at. So what makes this framework different is that it takes into account, I mean, we often speak about student-centered learning, but we need to take into account all aspects of learning, the student and the lecturer's perspective and everybody's part and place that's involved in the entirety of a learning space. So we need to consider real world contexts, circumstances of individuals as far as we possibly can. We can never design something that's perfect for one specific person, but where possible, we allow for things to be a little bit fluid, so that we take into account the possibilities of what somebody other than we can understand what someone else's needs are. And then we look at interests and the ways that we can bring those interests in. And then we also need to consider naturally the needs of the institution, of the graduate that's going to come out of the space, and what society needs in terms of what that graduate will offer at the end of everything. So looking at the enabled framework and the aim to promote this digitally enabled learning spaces for all, there's a strong focus on the blended learning aspect. And we'll have a conversation as to the benefits of having that blend and when to engage in what in different spaces and what can be powerful in terms of synchronous and asynchronous learning, and how we can leverage the one and the other to really work for us. So when we look at it, we need to look at the Enable framework and allowing us to look through a lens of assisting students and ensuring that there's equity for students, irrespective of this whole long list, and the list continues in terms of race, language, ethnicity, nationality, culture, ability, neurodiversity, age and religion. There's so much to consider about who we are and what makes us who we are and how we interact in spaces that we need that needs consideration if we are in a larger space. And many of us come from, I want to say, the older way of thinking about learning, where we just think about the learning and the outcomes, and everybody needs to conform to this one way. But the more we look at research, the more we are allowing ourselves to think differently about learning spaces, the more we can see that there's value in acknowledging the diversity that we find ourselves in the spaces, and enjoying on the strengths that other people bring as a result of the differences, that can really fuel a learning environment, and get to a positive outcome for all, not just the outcome that we are assuming for a typical um, average person, if we can put it in that way. So just looking at the enabled framework, in terms of an infographic, when we look at a course outline, we need to consider all the aspects that are encompassed within this framework. We need to look at how teaching and learning is going to take place, the ways in which we are allowing students to acquire or gain knowledge, the different ways of learning, how we are going about teaching. um, are we using different methods and different approaches to things? What outcomes and is the teaching and learning and the activities that we are doing speaking to outcomes? Are the outcomes and assessments aligned so that those activities can marry the two properly? What kind of evaluation of each aspect and the course as a whole do we have? And then finally, the learning materials and the technology that we are going to use. Are we assuming that students know how to use it? Are we using perhaps too much technology at once? So what sort of balance is there, and are we allowing students to prepare themselves for the course that we have? So just starting out with an activity and having a little bit of an interaction in the space and allowing us to think a little bit differently about what we value and what we think is important. I need to stop sharing my screen, so give me 1 second. Okay, so I'm going to share um, please do let me know if you all have access to that. Thank you for this. I'm sharing a Jamboard with you, and I'm going to share my screen so that you can see the Jamboard. Okay, for some reason, it did not allow me to create a Jamboard on my work Gmail, Google account. So I'm glad that it all shows up as anonymous right now. So if we think of um, creation and think of our course outline, think of what we just touched on in terms of diversity and all the aspects to consider. Um, if you think about it, what are 3 aspects that you feel is most important to consider when we are thinking about course outline creation? And for those of you who are not as familiar with the Jamboard space, if you click into it, you should see a space that such as the one that I'm sharing. If you move over to the left-hand side of your screen and hover over this, if you can see it says sticky note, and if you click on it, you'll be able to type in the space, and you can also change the color of it if you wish to. Could I ask you to think about this and post the 3 different aspects on 3 different sticky notes? I just want to see what comes out of it. And if somebody has posted something that you feel is important as well, then you are welcome to add that as your aspect too. So thank you to whoever's started the process. Um, but don't ever think that what your contribution is wrong. Nothing is wrong in space. Uh, when you think about it initially, what do you think is important that comes up? And I'm going to be silent and just allow you to think about it. Wow, colleagues, thank you so much for your contributions. And you can keep going. Um, it's so interesting to see how many perspectives can be in one space. Um, and as we can see that there is actually so much to consider. Um, and when we think about, I mean, we can group these in so many ways. Um, when we think about inspiring students, um, we think about how we can create spaces that can inspire students. But then what's also important to think about is making sure that we are clear about the type of assessments, that we are clear about the pathways that we are creating, um, that we are allowing for the evaluation of what students are doing themselves and what we are doing, and allowing the time for reflection. Often we only really stop and get the chance to reflect at the end of a course. And there's something about allowing for or planning um, in these spaces that allow us to sort of set parameters and set sort of stopping points to check in with students and check in with ourselves and say, has something worked? Is it working? But also set the tone for planning for success, taking the time to actually think about this flow and alignment between all the activities that we're considering, um, and think about what is important in terms of our journey as well as the student's journey to speak to success. Um, and success can mean different things for everyone, um, but how can we make sure that all of that is implemented? So I'm not too sure I'm going to open the floor if anybody wishes to give comment to anything that they've said, or if anyone has questions based on your input or on somebody else's inputs. Okay. It's okay if we don't have questions, if we don't have any comments, it's okay. I feel like this space is important to think about what other people think about, what somebody else deems important, and also just touch on aspects that perhaps I know many of us get caught up in this. I just need to get this course outline out. It's a requirement. I just need to get it done. And we often are pulled away from thinking about the importance of it, and how it can really guide what is needed for the pathway ahead in terms of the learning journey. Okay, thank you for your contributions. I'm going to stop sharing at this point, and just go back to my slides. Give me 1 second. Okay, so taking from all the aspects that's important to us and thinking of a course outline in general, um, when we think of it, we need to consider that it is a foundational document that helps us as well as students to know what to expect and for students to know what is expected of them. And often the time, if you think of even in schooling times, you think of co-creation of class rules and things like that. When we allow for this co-creation of students to have an input on aspects that are in our course outline or simply to give comment on it, it allows us to think of things differently. The understanding of we have a guide, um, and it helps us to stay on track, but we don't know what we don't know. And it's useful in spaces to get students' perspectives to understand where do we have gaps? Where is our thinking falling short or our understanding of the current context that might be very different from the context that they come from? And where can we bridge the gaps of what is needed in terms of where students are misunderstanding or where alternative wording or support might be needed? So then we ask the question of how well do we know our students? Um, and are we taking the time to use these spaces such as our orientation modules or the spaces before we get into the meat of our courses, to make sure that we know and understand our students from a personal perspective, um, and also just make sure that they feel heard. So when we think about it, we can sort of design or create in many different ways spaces to get to know our students in terms of why are they here, what makes them the space essential for them, or what motivates them to get into the space. What knowledge and skills do they feel that they bring into the space, and how can we utilize different interests or different other skills to make the space that they are in more comfortable, or to utilize it to the best of their ability, and make them feel that their individual skills are as valuable in this space as it would be in any other space. So when we think about it, are we creating safe spaces for students? And it's really tough to think about. If you think of a learning environment, and if I think of a learning environment, I come from spaces where, for me, you weren't allowed to be vulnerable. You had to be a student. You had to look like you were interested, or that you knew what you were doing. And it was really intimidating because everyone else was also looking like they knew what they were doing, whether they did or they didn't. Um, so this is where we can leverage the face-to-face and online spaces, and allow students to, or allow us to create spaces where perhaps we have anonymous spaces, so that students can feel that they can be vulnerable, that they can let us know about language barriers, or skills that they struggle with, where to find resources, or how to translate things in a way where they do feel that their contribution is valuable, or that the sentences are making sense, and they can feel confident about their contribution, that it is also being heard. Um, can they speak about the challenges or barriers that they are facing? And how do we create the safe spaces for students to feel like they can disclose specific things to us? And an example for me to share is, I am hard of hearing. And what I often don't realize is that I overcompensate by lip reading, or if somebody is speaking loud enough, I can hear them in a space. But if somebody turns their back to me, for example, and often of the time when we are in face-to-face spaces, we end up turning our backs to our classes to perhaps write on the board or sort something out, and we are still speaking at the same time. So allowing students to give comment will help us to think differently in spaces, and just pause for that second while we are in the face-to-face environment and say, okay, I can stop talking at this point and allow for the silence and complete what I need to do before I turn around and speak to my students again. So again, we don't know what we don't know, and there's a lot that we can consider, but it helps to have the safe spaces for students to be able to disclose things that they can often feel shy about disclosing, or feel very isolated in the experiences that they are having. So are we creating the spaces, and how often do we give students the spaces to give these voices? So do we allow it at the beginning of our course? Is it a space that we remind them of continuously, and that we are checking in on continuously throughout the course, to check in and say, is this still the best path? Or has something created a barrier, and how can we work our way through the barrier, whether it is for that single student or a group of students that are experiencing the same thing? And then being able to acknowledge students' strengths and the contributions that they make. How many times doesn't it make a difference for us to just feel that we have been heard? It helps for somebody to just say, I acknowledge that there is, for example, stress in the room right now, that everyone could be feeling stress as a result of whatever it is. And just having that acknowledgement of the fact that a student can be, or is possibly experiencing something, and giving the space for that, can make a big difference in the interaction that we have within those spaces. So if we think about how we can go about getting to know our students within the current cohort, are we maximizing the spaces that we have? And if we think about it, and I've removed one of the slides, but if we think about it, like, what are ways in which we can make sure that we are interacting and getting to know our students? So are we allowing for those open communication channels? Are we allowing for students to express needs? Are we using the spaces and the tools that we have, such as Padlets or, for example, the Jamboard that we've just used now, or even the discussions area within the Amatuba space? Are we allowing it to be anonymous at certain points to allow students to express what it is that they are feeling? Are we allowing students to give comment on certain documents? Is there a cutoff date for that? Are there specific points we can ask students to revisit what they have looked at, and evaluate whether certain things are still necessary or important? And it's again, I look back at, are we maximizing the time that we are given in which to do certain things within our course? I often um, go back to the lecturer understanding, or the behind the scenes of this understanding of, are we having a meeting for the sake of having a meeting? Are we having class or face-to-face class for the sake of having face-to-face class? Or are we making sure that there's enough value within that space? So in terms of orientation modules, you often think of orientation as you're just telling students about the course and about what they need to expect and where they can go to get help. But we are not thinking of whether students feel safe to just send a direct email. Is there another way in which they can make contact if need be? Are we allowing enough space for students to get to know each other? And are we encouraging the safe spaces of sort of debunking certain negative thoughts or ideas or natural judgments that can happen in certain spaces, and shifting the understanding? So in terms of how do we get to know the future cohort of students? Like if we think about it, if we're planning for next semester, next term, um, what can we consider in those spaces? So if we think of our course evaluations, it can be useful to go through those. We look at stats and data analytics, um, and using our LMS to really get data and analyze that data and consider what happened at certain points. As a lecturer, are you reflecting to say, at certain points, my students felt some type of way, or I didn't get as much interaction out of this activity, and consider the reasons for that and the alternatives that we can provide? And then looking at personas, and looking at, based on the previous cohort, based on real world trends, and looking at what those students have experienced. For example, are these majority of students who take comfort in online spaces because for a majority of their schooling during the COVID-19 pandemic, that is what they've experienced, is the face-to-face environment? Am I allowing for enough engagement or interaction within those face-to-face spaces, the actual classroom spaces, to allow students to interact in ways, even if they feel a bit uncomfortable in the space, but to push their boundaries as well, to make sure that we reach the student throughput and success, that we are setting them up for critical thinking skills, for being able to push through in difficult scenarios or working in uncomfortable environments, and making those situations work for them. So if we look at what methods and tools we can use. We spoke about the survey tool and the anonymous and in-person versus online. We can look at doing an online survey, having a discussion in class, and again, it's about creating that safe space within the classroom environment, as not everybody feels that they can speak in those environments. But using something like Google Forms to gather data might be really useful. Um, are we checking in, and allowing students to think about gaps or areas of improvement as we are actually going along the course? Perhaps there's something that we've tried for the first time, or we realize that students were not as engaging as the previous cohort, and perhaps we have a bit of reflection and figure out why that is. So in larger cohorts, you can, in terms of the creation of course outlines, having a course outline there, or focusing on certain points and asking students within larger groups to have discussions about it, how they feel about it. Perhaps there's questions as prompts, and then we can use spaces like Jamboards and Padlets for students to collate their inputs and sort of give input in one space. and sort of analyze that in a different space or ask for discussion so that adjustments can be made before the course begins. In smaller cohorts, you can have students perhaps prepare a short video or audio. You can give them prompts to speak of, allowing students to get out of their comfort zone a little bit, and allowing that safe space for them to be vulnerable in. So you can use Padlets, you can use Amatuba's discussion areas. And again, it's not only limited to those, and it's not only limited to what we are speaking about in the space, um, but you need to make it relevant for your context and what you know works. Um, so for me, the important thing is to set the right intention. If you are allowing the space for students to co-create, um, and help to sort of formulate or design the best pathway in terms of this course outline, where both you and students have a clear understanding of the way forward. Are your intentions there, and do students feel like their input is valuable? Remember, you can often tell when somebody's not as genuine or is doing something for the sake of running through a process as opposed to actually showing that care. And a way in which we allow for students to be vulnerable in the space is for us to be vulnerable in the space. And I think as lecturers, we often don't realize the big gap between what I call the us and them. Um, that students often feel very intimidated by lecturers within the learning spaces. Are we allowing students to be vulnerable by sharing our experiences? And we're not saying turning it into a therapy session or um, share too much about your life that you're not comfortable with, but sharing your own experiences, perhaps of what you went through as a student and what made you feel uncomfortable, or where you have barriers um, to accessing certain venues or rushing from one venue to another, um, or what challenges you have within perhaps larger classes or smaller classes environments. By sharing what makes you vulnerable, students are more likely to be vulnerable and see you as a person outside of the role you play as that lecturer and facilitator of learning. So we need to be considerate of the power dynamics and how we can sort of soften that within a space. And it's also to understand that students come into a space with a lot of knowledge themselves, knowledge of things that we perhaps have no idea about, and they're not blank slates. We are here to help construct and rebuild their knowledge in a different way that sets them along a pathway towards where they hope to achieve. Uh, so it's to help reformulate and reprogram what and the way they are thinking, not just to give them information and assume that they don't know. So if we think about it, there are many roads that lead to the same destination. There's not only one way to go about doing this. And if we look at um, this image shows 10 stops on a map, and it shows different ways in which we can go about getting to those stops. There are different pathways and there's different angles and ways. We can start from the end, we can start from the beginning. There's no real beginning and end. It's just showing the different stops. But it can take a shorter or longer amount of time. It can take less steps or more steps, however it is that you wish to structure your program so that you can get to all those steps. So again, it's about what works for you and what is easiest. And we talk about alignment, the flow or an alignment between start and finish. Is it the easiest flow and alignment in terms of understanding and in terms of getting through all the necessary aspects to get from start to finish? And we say begin with the end in sight and allow students to think of where it is they want to end up, and then think of the pathway that's going to get them there. And naturally, we need to also acknowledge that you as the educator, as the lecturer, as the facilitator of learning, bring your own understanding of the knowledge and concepts and their own understanding of how the courses have run in previous cohorts to be able to advise and suggest things, suggest that pathway, and explain to students the reasons for certain things being the way they are. Okay, so I'm going to pause and allow for a time of discussion and allow to think about the diversity of students that we have in our spaces, our diversity as individuals, and how we can go about co-creating our course outline. What sort of diversity, what are things perhaps that we have brought about or spoken about today that you've not considered before? What perhaps challenges do you foresee um, in implementing something like this? What questions do you have for perhaps colleagues doing having a different type of cohort? So if anybody wishes to ask a question or comment on what has been discussed thus far. I'm going to stop sharing my screen just for now to allow for any input or voices on um, what you think about diversity and inclusivity in terms of course outline. How do you feel about thinking about students having comment on a course outline? Having students perhaps question why certain things are in place. Does it make you, would it make you question what you are doing? Would it make you feel uncomfortable? Do you think it will assist you in terms of design? Cheryl, you can go ahead. Anybody's welcome to put on their microphone. You don't have to put up your hand.
Okay, so I was just responding to Joseph's comment, thinking about when you undertake evaluations and would it be a good idea to do them every week? And I mean, it's a great idea, but the thing is, that's a very responsive kind of evaluation schedule, and the students start expecting you to change something next week. So I think only use that strategy if you realistically can actually undertake those changes. And I think perhaps as a minimum, we should try and do the pre-course, mid-course, post-course evaluation, because so often it's only the end of the course evaluation, whereas the pre-course and the mid-course give the opportunity for the current cohort of students to get some feedback so you can get to know them. Otherwise, if you only have the course evaluation at the end, you always only working on historic data, I should say. And that doesn't help for that cohort, and it makes it less likely for them to answer evaluations because they don't see the immediate benefit for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So linking it back to the course outline, I would suggest that you make it clear in the course outline why you are undertaking a particular strategy and what this will mean for them, so they are motivated, and yeah, so that they understand that the logic, it's not just like a tick box. So often the course evaluations are often seen as only a tick box, and whereas the other ones, the pre and the mid, can still make the responses that the lecturer may provide relevant to that cohort. Thanks, Donna.
Thank you so much. It's such a valuable contribution. And I think there's also value in having that conversation with students and perhaps also letting them know. I think with students, they can often think that your class is the only one that you are lecturing, their class. And often of the time, it's okay to let students know that I also have a full plate. There's also a lot going on. This is where I try my best to fit you in, or this is where I've made time to look at your contributions, or look at your assessments, and to understand your dynamic. And then also perhaps say to students, I would love to review things weekly. I mean, I might leave the option there for you to do that, but realistically, this is the time that I do have to look at it. It's not that I don't want to consider, but in terms of time frame and work that still needs to get done, in having that sort of open discussion to say, is it reasonable to expect me to do this? And if students do understand your full plate, they might say, no, that's actually not reasonable at all. And then agreeing on, as Cheryl said, that the pre, the mid, and the post, agreeing on that, and letting them know it's not that you don't want to hear their voices, it's about the spaces, but that you do want them to feel that they are being heard. So thank you so much, Joseph, for bringing that up and asking that question, and Cheryl for your profound response. Really good perspective and way of thinking about things, and good to have that discussion. Michelle, I agree with you. Change is not easy. I think in general, within institutional context, we become so conditioned to doing something the way it's always been done, and pushing for that change um, can stir a lot of things up. Um, you can also be questioned as to, now you have started the ball rolling and done this, and my students are starting to question. Perhaps another lecturer says, and my students are starting to question why I am not doing it. Um, so perhaps having a bit of a discussion and understanding of it, in terms of in a departmental environment, what you plan on doing, and the potential um, questions that could arise as a result of it. Um, so there are definitely benefits with making the changes, and we also don't have to start out by making all the changes at once. And I think a lot of the time we learn something new, like, okay, I'm going to do this. We can start out by testing the waters and perhaps just doing a quick check-in with students with regards to, think of, or these are prompts, think about it and comment on it with regards to what you have seen in the course outline, and whether it is just a quick quiz or something for them to go through, firstly, so that you make sure that they've read the course outline, but that you've given them the space to give comment. Um, so thank you for that contribution. I'm just trying to read in the chat, and thank you for everybody that's Vanessa, maybe plan a lesson or two where students can choose out some of the topics, perhaps. There are many ways to go about it, and I love the thinking that's coming about, because it is what works in your context. And like I said, this thing. Um, so if you think of, for example, an assessment practice, we also become so used to that students have to be assessed in this specific way. And yes, we are bound by policy and guidelines, and but perhaps a student, for some or other reason, cannot show you the full extent of the knowledge and understanding that they have gained by being assessed in that specific way. So are we perhaps creating spaces where we allowing students to be, we have the assessment, but we are allowing students to choose the way in which they can present what they have done or their understanding to us, so that it does speak to the way in which they are able to give their best, as opposed to setting out but stricter parameters, and perhaps excluding students in ways that we don't know or understand. Thank you, Janet. The importance of the small changes. Um, um, I'm not too sure if anybody else wants to put their microphone on, or share anything else about the experience, or perhaps trying to implement change, what can possibly make you resistant to change, or what would make you resistant to testing out this process, or sort of what has shifted in your mind in terms of how it might be useful. Okay, I see there is typing going on in the chat. Um, I am going to share my slides because I'm almost at the end of sharing today's session. Michelle, you can go ahead. I see your hand is up.
Thank you. Yeah, I think what I was trying to say is that, you may now, okay, you've got this great idea to change this, change that, but now we're sitting halfway through the year. The meetings to change anything for next year are done and dusted. Printing's happening. So you can't do it for next year. So you think, okay, well, we'll do it for the following year. But by then, there's something else that may trigger your way or whatever. And I'm just, it's just I find it extremely frustrating that you want to do things and you want the cohorts' opinions and assessments and things, but then we've got to make these decisions way before the year's even basically even gone through the middle part of the year. And I find that very frustrating because now you want to do something for next year, but you actually can't because it's set in stone already unless you go through I don't know if you can change it because they've already had their meetings and they've had this and these deadlines I understand why they're deadlines so early in the year for the following year, but it's not like we're really printing stuff anymore. It's all online stuff. So I'm just wondering if in the old days, yes, when the red book or whatever color book was at the time, we used to call it the red book, is printed, I can understand that. But now that we can change things to go online, I'm not quite sure why we have to do it so early in for the next year. I don't get this. I'm sure these big institutions all have the same thing, but I'm just wondering if we should be with things that are changing. We've got to be able to change, but we're forced not to change. And I find that we're going through all this transformation, we're going through all these curriculum decisions and all this, but great. But then when we want to change it, we can't because the paperwork is done. And I find that as convener or lecturers or whatever, very, very frustrating. So I think, UCT has to come to the idea, okay, these things, we're trying to evolve, we're trying to change, we're trying to listen to students, but then they don't get listened to because our hands are tied. That's sometimes what I find very frustrating anyway.
Thank you. That's a very valuable contribution. And I must say, when we had this discussion within the SILT environment, when the Enable framework was being outlined for us, that's one thing that definitely came up about how much policy and procedure and the way things need to be set out before the time can hinder the process or the change that you're trying to implement. And I really value Cheryl's comment on saying that you can set things out in the outline, but you don't perhaps have to be as specific. So perhaps allow for the way in which we word things, or the way we set it out, allow for the fluidity in terms of sort of putting detail in at a later stage. So allowing for the gist of what needs to be done, and then sort of putting those little bit of adjustments that's needed into it. For example, you don't have to list all the technologies and tools, or perhaps you want to list it and say the possibility of one of these will be used. The assessment types could be or will draw from a range of, and in this way, for example. So it does require a lot of thought. And it does require us to actually have to re-look at that course outline. And I know we're guilty of it. We're guilty of taking it and just going and change the dates for the next year because that's what needs to be done. So it does take time to have to sit and think about how we're going to word and structure it in a way that can allow for inputs along the way. And the resources that we are going to share, I'll follow the session up with an email. The resources to what is an outline, a sample of a course outline, but also a checklist, to ask ourselves those necessary questions like, are we, in what way are we allowing for student input or allowing us to consider diversity, so that you yourself can sort of evaluate and go through this checklist and say, am I thinking about these things, or am I leaving gaps to allow for these things within the course outline as it's created? So thank you so much. It's so valuable um, to hear all the contributions and to think about everything that we need to consider, especially with implementing change. And I think what I value is all of you that are in this room currently, um, because that change is something that you've already considered by just sitting and listening within the space. I am aware that my battery is about to die very soon. So just in terms of thinking about inclusivity and course co-creation, um, if we think about um, how we can allow students to participate, to feel that they've been heard, how, in ways in which we can encourage, sorry, encourage students to know that we've considered what gaps there are and the ways in which we are sort of filling those gaps, but allowing for choice, allowing for autonomy and voice within everything, and allowing for students to take ownership. Like, you've agreed to this, or have we all agreed? This is your chance to agree to things, so that as things progress, we can say, you know, we have agreed to it, or we have allowed the spaces for it, and to really give them the space to utilize that for to the best of their ability, and to come back at a later stage and say, we've agreed to this, and was the value and the reasoning behind doing things the way that we've done it. And perhaps in allowing students to reflect, we can also think of asking students how they felt about contribution towards the course outline. If they do feel something needs to be changed, and having them think about what needs to be changed, and whether their change is for preference or whether they truly feel their change is going to make a difference in their output, and perhaps what they wish they lecturer had known or knows about them, um, which a lot of the time there's things that you don't think of, but if you can word it in that way and question students in that way, it's interesting to see what comes up. Okay, and then finally, just in conclusion, for today's session, I know we've spoken about a lot, and there's a lot to think of and consider, a lot of restrictions, a lot of possibilities, but I'm not too sure, Philip, if you can paste in the chat. Um, thank you so much. I'm going to try my best to share my screen, and I'm hoping that my battery does not die while I'm doing that. Or perhaps we can just do it in the chat. My apologies. You don't have to use the word cloud. Just in thinking about today's session and everything that we've discussed, all the little aspects, what is one perspective or one takeaway for you from today's session? You can type it in the chat. Um, you don't have to press enter yet. I'll let you know when you can press enter and send it, but reflecting on the discussion that we've had today on the Enable framework, on thinking about inclusivity and diversity, just type in the chat, don't send it yet, but what is one perspective or takeaway from today's session? Or if it's a question that you have, you know, a question that's still lingering in your mind. Okay, when you are ready, you can press enter. So for those of you who have it already, 3, 2, 1.
about that. Just dropped off. Aspects, challenges of curriculum changes by lectures. Digital engagement between students and lecturers. More student engagement. Consider specific aspects of your course where students can give input, where you'll be able to incorporate it without major overhaul. Taking more cognizance of students' feelings, anxieties, and fears. I think that's already such a profound takeaway from today's session. And can I say thank you for allowing yourself to be open to gaining perspective from today, to thinking of your course outline in a different way, with something that perhaps you're not pushed to think about. And perhaps you do have a bit of resistance to this and say, I might not think about it specifically in terms of my course outline, but perhaps I'm going to think about it, students in general, moving forward. Okay, this hour has gone by so quickly. Thank you so much for engaging, listening, and taking from today's session. I wish you all the best in terms of the new semester, and your plans moving forward in terms of your engagement with students. If you have any questions, please feel free to email myself or Philip, and we will be sharing the slides and the links to resources with you at the end of today's session. Thank you so much to my colleagues who have been on the session today, who have supported and facilitated the discussion, but also who have been a part of creating this Enable framework, and really sparking our thinking of student diversity in such a different way.